Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, this is the 300th episode of Superhero Ethics. I had totally lost count because we'd counted in a couple different ways that made no sense. But I am so happy to be here because we're talking about a topic that's been like throughout the very beginnings. One of our first episodes was about is Magneto right? Now we're continuing conversations like that, talking about X-Men 97 with a great group of people. As always, I have my co-host, Riki Hayashi, but we're joined by two people from what is quickly becoming one of my other favorite podcasts, Will Freeland and Steve Stormoen from the Hype is My Superpower podcast. These folks are reading every Marvel comic book so that you don't have to, or you can if you want to still, but as I've said before, they do a great job of summarizing them. And a lot of times we're talking with them about, okay, well, what is this story like on the page? And today we're getting to bring them back to talk about what it's like on screen. This is not the first time we're going to have them on. We're probably going to have them on again to talk specifically about the Genosha plot line. I said that mostly to get Will to make that expression. I'll put that in the TikTok. Um, but there's so much about this show that I want all four of us to get to dive into. But let me just kind of start by letting you guys, scream like little girls for a little sec. Let me just start by letting you guys scream like little kids for a little bit. Will, what did you think of the show?
Oh man, I, I had a okay. Well, thank you for having me. First off,
Yeah, thank you.
s- assuming you survived the episode, but that's
Really,
very
everyone gets
X Men.
attacked at the episode. Go ahead.
Yeah,
It's very X Men to welcome a new student and say, "Welcome to the X Men. Hope you survive the experience."
yep.
So that was aptly timed. But I had a great time with X97. I will say I think episode 10 might be like bottom 3 as far as emotions that I felt watching the episodes. But like every episode either gave me chills and or I teared up and or cried. Like this was the I don't feel like they ever slowed down. Like the slowest they went was like the life death episode, or maybe the Motendo episode. But
Yeah,
but they still hit hard. Like
I
they pulled everything. It was so much fun. But yeah, I just it took, let's see, it's 10 episodes over 9 weeks. It took me 9 weeks to get Steve to watch.
yeah, I
Show,
watched
and he finally
literally
did,
the
and I'm
whole
so
show
excited.
in one sitting last night from like 8 p.m. to 1 a.m.
I'm going to take some credit for getting Steve to watch, particularly the fact
That
Will,
was all
Listen,
you, Matthew.
all I need is a deadline. Will's like, you should watch this, and I'm like, yes, I should, I will, but it could happen at any time. And Matthew, you're like, hey, we're recording, on Thursday, and I'm like, okay, now I have a deadline. Now I can bound my time. Best X-Men adaptation ever. It I think so. I wish it could have slowed down a little bit. There were a lot of character arcs. Everyone except for Wolverine had a character arc, which I find fascinating considering how focused the show, every adaptation has been on Wolverine otherwise. Maybe Morph didn't really have much of an arc. But
Morph
you
had an
know,
interesting thing going on, which I
they
think we'll
did.
get
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, they definitely did. But it was, there were moments and pieces, whereas, you can point to like Storm and say, well, this is the long arc, or Jean or Scott. They all have these like long arcs that take them through the whole season in a way that is very X-Men. It's always been about large ensemble casts, and sort of long, slow burn character arcs that pull them through. So I was absolutely stoked with the way that they loved and paid attention to their characters in this. I wish we had a little more time to get a little more granular with it and
Mhm.
and have them struggle through their arcs a little bit more. But yeah, it was absolute home run.
Makes sense. And Riki, for yourself, now that you've seen the last episode, which you hadn't seen the last time we talked about it, what's kind of your overall thoughts on the show?
I think I agree with Will that the finale, I mean, it's a letdown because so much of what was going on in the show was great. It was still a good episode, but yeah, like the highlight for me has got to be kind of the mid-season finale. I mean, it was a short season, right? But the Remember Me, the Gambit Genosha episode was just like
Oh
on
my
every
god.
single level, like such a good episode of television. It's hard to match that when you do that in the middle of the season for the finale to
Mhm.
match, especially because of the way TV shows are structured and what a finale like needs to do, like wrap up as much as it can, and also kind of hint at and set up future stuff in this case, like a next season. So yeah, like the finale did what it needed to do, but it didn't hit on all the levels that I would have wanted it to, but that's fine. Like it didn't I
Right.
don't think it needed to
Mhm.
do all
That
that.
makes sense. Well, and
Yeah.
like I said, we're not here to do a review, but I wanted to start back, just kind of set the context for all this. I definitely think Will and Steve, I hope you guys are going to do more of a straight up review on your podcast, and certainly I'm happy to volunteer myself as a guest for that. But I want to talk about some of the issues that the show brings up, because part of why we've been talking about the X-Men on this podcast since the very beginning is it's always been one of the comic book stories that really does a great job of not just making it, good guys good, bad guys bad, um, and let's punch each other, but really raising some interesting questions. Well, I'm gonna keep my editorial comments about how well this season did that to myself. But moving on, um, the first question I want to jump into, and we're going to ask you two about the kind of question Riki and I really wrestled with last time towards the end, but I want to start with a question that we didn't get a chance to talk about, which is this idea that superheroes can retire. Because at the start of the season, I was really excited by the idea that Steve and Jean Grey were going to get to say,
Scott.
look, we're,
Well, Scott.
oh, did I say Steve? Sorry, Scott,
Yeah.
Cyclops, Cop Boy. I'll just call him Cop Boy. ACAB X-Men. That Cyclops and Jean Grey were going to get to basically kind of take a sabbatical for a while, if not a full-on retirement, and raise their kid. And to me, this is such an important issue because it's one that I of course always care about superheroes for the fun stories, but also for the stories of how they affect us in the real world. And no one that I know about has superpowers. I mean, your hype is pretty freaking awesome. But as far as I understand, it doesn't come from the sun or an X gene. As someone who's worked in the activist field most of my life, the single biggest thing that wipes out activists is burnout, and is the like, you never take a vacation, you never take a day off because the fight always needs you. And it's something that I see recognized in heroes all the time. And so I'm curious, like, how did you all think about this storyline of it was presented as them kind of wanting this, but also effects kind of pushing them into it. And then by the end, they don't really get to take it. How did you feel about how this storyline was played out?
First of all, I can absolutely empathize with the experience of activist burnout. I think I personally reached terminal burnout. I can almost pinpoint the day in 2010, and I've just been kind of grinding myself past it ever since.
Mhm.
Um, and so the idea of superheroes retiring, specifically Scott and Jean, has been something that they've tried to do a million times, and this was in the comics, I should say.
Right.
And just to give a little background, I know we're not talking about the comics, but I think it gives a little an
Sure. Yeah, that's
interesting
fair.
sort of. Um, it was the original intention of Chris Claremont, the writer of the X-Men comics from 1975 to 1991, really transforming that comic from being on the brink of cancellation to the biggest thing in comic books and pop culture. Um, and it was his intention to retire characters permanently. And so after Jean Grey died during the Phoenix storyline, Scott met Madeline Pryor, who was not initially intended to be Jean's clone, and they were going to go live in Alaska, and maybe he'd come in for a storyline or something, but he would be basically retired as a character and they would move along. This is not the way that the publishing industry for superheroes operates. You cannot let an idea die. once you have an intellectual property that is resonating with people for whatever reason, and it's really unfortunate for Scott in particular because his arc is so much about family, and the show touches on this really well, I think. Feeling abandoned by his parents, growing up an orphan, and growing up in orphanages and being abused in orphanages, and family is so important to him, wanting a fresh start, needing a fresh start, needing this sort of connection, and finding this as his ultimate way to be a better person. Um, but yeah, and that's why it's specifically interesting to view this through the lens of Scott and Jean, um, because the stakes aren't higher for anybody else to be a good parent and to make that the center of their life, and yet his responsibilities to, like you said, the movement, always pull him back in.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Um,
I have a specific quote from Claremont pulled up here where he's talking about the Madeline Pryor storyline. It says Scott was going to move on, Jean was dead, get on with your life, and
yeah.
it's close to a happy ending. Then, unfortunately, Jean was resurrected. Scott dumps his wife and kids and goes back to the old girlfriend. And like
Yes,
it was not his decision to do the second part, and
not at
it's
all.
really a shame because I agree. Like X-Men to me is most exciting when it's like a rotating cast. And like
Yeah.
so much of the, especially like the visual
Yeah.
media has been focused on the Cyclops X-Men. But in the comics, like you keep moving on and you have different teams, like much more so than the Avengers, I feel.
Absolutely. And it's also, it goes back to sort of the original utopian vision of what the X-Men are. If we sort of like accept the integrationist vision of Charles Xavier, then at some point you have to actually freaking integrate, and you have to retire. You have to stop being superheroes or paramilitary activists or whatever you call it, and go get a job. And I want to see Jean Grey as a public school teacher. I want to see Scott, I don't know, he he
He'd
wouldn't
be a
make
fantastic engineer, I guess.
I think like security or something. Like, let's be real, he's not quite a cop, but he can't take himself out of, or he would be like
Yeah.
management of some sort, right? Like
Yeah.
he's
District manager of Kmart. Yeah.
that would be hilarious. But yeah, like I want to see them get jobs. I want to see them actually integrate. And it's a real tragedy of like a contradiction of the way that we do IP and the way that big companies hold on to characters forever, that they're never able to actually fulfill this core part of their own the moral arc of the X-Men.
Right. I mean, it's the same way you'll never see Batman actually fix the city and government and police department of Gotham to the point that he can just go back to being Bruce Wayne somewhere.
Sure.
And he'll never age, even though every child he adopts does.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point there about the kind of what that storytelling does, because I started with a burnout of activists because that's kind of where I've seen it most prevalently. But I think this is true with everything. This is
Mm.
true with the person whose parent is sick, and like, you know, their sibling might say like, look, go take a vacation, I'll take care of mom for a week or two, but it's hard for them. The person who your boss isn't hiring enough people, and so you take it upon yourself to like, we have to help keep, make sure that the cook doesn't have a bad time because we're not here, because you can't ever take that break for yourself. And it's interesting because you kind of started getting into the second that I think is very related, which is the idea of like individual versus ensemble stories. And I think that that's very linked, because I think that there's a topic that we've talked about on this podcast before, is that, the great man of history idea, the like, one person can come along, or one small team of 4 or 5 people can come along and they can fix the world. That's not actually really how the world works a lot of the time. And it's kind of a
Mhm.
dangerous idea, and to be pushing that all the time. But as you said, also a story about 100 X-Men, like, I think Justice League kind of pulled it off, and I think Star Wars: The Clone Wars kind of pulled it off. But it's a very difficult thing to do, and I never expected that they would take Scott and Jean Grey totally off the field. But I think I would have liked it a lot more if they had really gotten to allow themselves to retire, and for the first couple episodes they were not really part of it. And then like the stuff with their baby and like what happened with it and how it all ties into the larger story. If it had been a kind of like, yes, events pulled them back in, but the general attitude of the X-Men had been not, oh, you're abandoning us, but just you did your part, you fought the fight. Now it's time for new people to step up.
Yeah, Wolverine really dropped the ball there.
Unfortunately, with the way that X-Men the animated series left the storyline, like what they did with the Madeline Pryor stuff in this series was okay, but it didn't allow for that because they, as Steve said, Madeline in the comics is a actual like distinct different person when we meet her. Like she's Madeline Pryor. It's like, oh, but you look like Jean Grey, and I think she actually like slaps Scott when he suggests that and gets mad about it. So, yeah, like that, it would have been cool to see that play out and have Scott, as you say, off the board for like even a whole season. And then at the end, like, stuff happens. And when we were talking about like, do soldiers get to retire? Like, I was thinking of John Wick, he's the retired hitman, and having like a John Wick style return for Cyclops, where he's like, I guess I'm back. And like digs up his old visor. Like that would have been really cool for me and like a good way to have him off for a while and be happy. But yeah, like people want to see their favorites come back, right? Unfortunately,
yeah, I want to see
that
Dad
is how
Bod
like media works.
Cyclops. Yeah.
Oh God. No reality has ever had Dad Bod Cyclops.
Can't call him Slim anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. It also, just quick sidebar, he uses his powers in such cool and inventive ways.
Just the first episode was so cool.
I know.
Sorry.
Yeah.
They finally did it. They finally were
Yep.
like, it's not just like a
It's
laser
concussive.
beam.
It's just
Yeah.
it's force. It's
Yeah.
not hot. Like
I will say I found, it's not that I found him more interesting in this than I found him in other things. It's that I found him interesting for the first time, which is a real
Yeah.
result compared to every
It's
other
an accomplishment.
Everyone has that.
Yeah.
Everyone gets that moment
Yeah.
at some
Yep.
point in
Yep.
their like
I
Marvel
still feel,
history.
The
It's
moment
so
where
fun.
he's giving that interview with Trish Tilby and he snaps and he said like there's this break between the things that he can talk about in public and the things he can't, and the resentment that he's carried along the way from having to be this person. And you're right, it's such a burnout moment, and it's such a burden moment, and these are things, ideas that have been clearly with him this whole time. And also like he's been influenced by Magneto. Like this, when you talk about the age-old ethical sort of like quandary that's been done to death between Xavier and Magneto, like Magneto is having his influence over the X-Men team in certainly for Scott, and it was explored this way in the comics too, a very positive way.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can
Both
see,
like
I definitely see that. Oh, go ahead, Ricky.
the accomplishment that this show had with Cyclops, both in making him interesting, as you say, but also in the 3-part finale, making it believable and possible that he might turn his back on Charles and go with Magneto, because that has been a storyline in comics. And I thought that the way they played it and the speech that he gives when Charles comes back, I was like, oh, is he about to leave? Like, are they going to do that with him? And it still could be, they could do that storyline in the future because they've set this up for his character, that he has had this break.
Yeah.
I think it's great because like so much Cyclops media has just been boring Cyclops, just like the good soldier to Charles, and he like never questions him. And this was like, I love it because so much has been Wolverine centric in X-Men. It's like, yeah, like give us the good Cyclops or like interesting
Yes.
Cyclops. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's a good
100%.
segue to the next topic, because although I'm sure we'll keep talking about all of these, as you were kind of saying, Riki, I think one of the one of the things they did is that we didn't spend the whole time comparing Cyclops to Wolverine. I think they made kind of Wolverine a punk in most of this, and like not in the good way. I don't know how the writers were just like, okay, screw Hugh Jackman. We're making Wolverine just a terrible character. But I really appreciated that there was no love triangle between. It was just like, no, she's pregnant with his baby. Like they are happy together.
Mhm.
Sorry, Wolverine, go kick rocks. But then, I guess the Madeline Pryor story is kind of interesting. Although, like to me, you gave me Spider Queen for one episode, and I was like, I'm sorry, Goblin Queen for one
Goblin
episode,
Queen.
and I'm convinced that the new hot couples cosplay should be Jareth the Goblin King and Madeline the Goblin Queen as the cross thing, because like her outfit was just phenomenal. And then
Yeah,
after that, everything else was let down. But
This was the toned down version, Matthew.
it sure was.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
well, she was wearing
Yeah,
a lot more
I
than
did
she does in
Google
the
it earlier and
comics.
saw the she's using the 5% of her mental powers to keep the covering over her to keep her outfit legal. But Google it if you think I'm kidding. It's really ridiculous. But my question is, so then we get that love triangle, and we get Rogue and Cajun
Magneto.
Man and Old Man Teacher, and like just
Gambit.
all of these love triangles. Why? Why do
Um,
people think we need like to me it felt like very lazy writing in terms of just like here's a cliche, let's just do it again and again and again.
I mean, they're honoring the original characters and stories to some degree, right? Like these are relationships baked into the X-Men. I think the problem here was that they just rushed it or like didn't give it enough time to breathe in the way that like a good, more romantic centric story would give these time to breathe, and it just kind of had like a beat here, and then you have to have a fight, so like that happened, right? So
yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And activist polycules are messy, and you
Yeah,
If
I'm
polyamory
like
was
I think of it.
for a
I think
moment,
of it
I
as
would have a
like
different conversation, but
yeah.
co-ed high school groups. This kind of thing happens, but when you take it from high school age to young adults and then put them in life and death situations that they live through together, like those kinds of passions happen. But I also agree there wasn't enough time spent on these to really make it feel organic. But I also I think they could have just skipped over the Magneto Rogue thing. Like it's a thing from the comics, but like it never needed to happen in the first place.
It's so much worse.
How old was she?
That is so much worse in the show. Yeah, how old is she? Because she was in the comics when Magneto and Rogue have their pairing. Rogue has been a member of the X-Men for a while, and she's much more grown up than like before she meets the X-Men, while she's still living with Mystique, her mom. Like, yeah, that is truly troubling.
Yeah, but like, so I think that's something that could have, if they had spent more time, because the whole like intrigue for Rogue is that it's somebody that she can touch, and so it's this drug that you can't have, and then someone shows up and they're like, look, you could have this literal part of human affection with me. And so like she can do, if they gave her time to do this like mental anguish of like, it doesn't make sense, this doesn't work, but oh my gosh, I can touch. Like I see that playing out better with more time. But even then, I still don't
on
think
her
it needed to
side,
happen.
not on his side.
No. Yeah, more Rogue internal struggle time and like figuring out where she actually sees this play out, instead of like total of like maybe 10 minutes of 5 of it being like, hey, this has happened in the past, and then 5 minutes of her giving him a kiss and being like, well, maybe that's not right, and moving on. Give me more.
The whole thing felt really off, particularly because like obviously Magneto was the one she could touch, but also it did feel like she like Scott was being a lot affected by Magneto's ideas, and of course, like you talked about Scott's speech to Professor X, and I think that was a decent one, but I really loved what Rogue had to say to him about to Professor X when she walks away from him, and then of course joins Magneto for a bit before the writers decide to stop. Well, I made that point. Never mind. Sorry, I'm so angry about that. But putting that aside, So the fact that like, and then when both Magneto and um Cajun Boy, Gambit, when they both are believed to have died, and she has just been like professing her feelings about Magneto, and all of a sudden she's like, "Oh my god, I can't believe Gambit's dead." Magneto, who?
Hmm.
Like she doesn't have a moment of grief about him. And yeah, that just felt like I hear what you're saying, and I think love triangles do form sometimes among teenagers or adults, or any adults of any age, but it, making everything a love triangle just felt kind of it's not that it's like love is this messy, it's that felt way too neat. Like
Hmm.
to me, what would make more sense is like, yeah, these people are together, but this person has a crush on that person, and that person has a crush on yet another person.
Sure.
Like, just if you want to go that way, go a long freaking chain,
Yeah.
or just maybe just back off that a little bit.
Yeah, I would have preferred a more deft touch on Magneto in particular there, and having him, maybe Rogue is pursuing him, and he's like, I don't know, you're really young. This is weird. She's like, but we can touch, like, uh, um, even though her heart is somewhere else. I don't know. Yeah, that could have been done much better. And I think it was mostly done for plot reasons to build up Gambit's sacrifice and then also her defection. And it was less about the plot of the romance and more about bringing those character
Yeah.
arcs to a specific point, which is unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
So I liked the Magneto, Rogue, Gambit trio, and I do think they could have been given more time, or like more screen time. But in particular, the scene where Rogue and Gambit in Genosha are talking like by the fireplace, I think,
Mm,
was like
Mm-hmm.
one of the best scenes in that episode
yeah.
and on the show. And they did so much for those characters in that one scene that it makes me enjoy that storyline more compared to Jean, Scott, and Wolverine. Like it just felt so off that Jean, like I can't even remember if it was Jean or Madeline, but one of them kisses Wolverine, right? When he
Jean
like
does.
gives a nice like, oh, like dude, motivational speech.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even like a peck, it was like a kiss on the
Right.
lips, right? And
Yeah.
I'm
But I
like,
mean, I think
what are
Logan
you
played that
doing? You're
well, though.
married.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I
That felt
mean,
a real low
yeah.
point.
Yeah, I don't know. It's the type of thing you either let go or it bugs you. I feel
Yeah.
like it's again, it's something that's happened in the comics. It's a thing that they had to sort of like they had to close definitively Logan's interest in order to make the story more about Scott and Jean and Madeline, and because that was such a like ongoing part in the original show of Wolverine's just like ongoing obsession with Jean. I think they had to find a way to close that off more or less definitively in order to refocus those character arcs elsewhere.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And I will say, I thought at first it was going to be Logan gets with Madeline in a way that, like, look, they both get to be with Jean Grey, and that would
Oh,
really have made me mad. So I'm
yeah,
glad it
that
didn't
would
go
have
that way.
sucked.
That's
I
what
wonder if they'll
Havoc is
actually,
for.
Yeah, Scott's brother ends up with Madeline.
yeah.
Oh,
Putting it back a
gosh,
bit
that's
to the Rogue, Gambit, Magneto part of it, though. I think the other thing is that part of why these stories frustrate me sometimes is that they always pit it as though the only thing that competes with romantic love is another romantic love.
Mm,
Whereas I think you could have told mostly that same story. Like, granted, the idea of can she touch another person or not, and how important is that? Like, that feels like it should get a lot of attention if it's going to get any attention, and as we discussed, it didn't. But if you're willing to pull back from that a little bit, I think another very real story that a lot of people go through is loyalty towards like a paternal mentor figure versus towards a romantic interest. And
mm,
you could have made that the story of, Gambit is pulling her in one direction, Magneto's pulling her in another, without it ever having to be any sense of romance between her and Magneto. But that made, it's kind of the like, do you go with more of the father, or not even fatherly, but mentor figure versus, the romantic figure.
I agree with that. Although I do think that specifically is something that's done well in Scott's arc. He is having to choose between, kind of choosing between Madeline and Jean, but more between, like his responsibilities as a father and towards the mother of his child and the woman that he loves. So I thought that was drawn out fairly well in a different context in the show.
That's fair.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. I was like, well, if you take the love triangle com- feedback and put it towards the Scott thing, you can make that exact argument. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
Okay.
I think it was just all about setting up Gambit's sacrifice and Rogue's turn of allegiance, and it was
Mhm.
just an unfortunate way to do that.
Yeah.
So let me then ask about Morph. Do we think that Morph is in love with Logan, with Wolverine?
No,
Hmm.
not romantically.
But there's hints, right? Like it is a plausible direction that this character
Yeah,
could be
maybe.
going.
It's a
I mean,
plausible
and
direction.
Maybe.
it
And-
depends
and-
on like if the writers want to go there, because obviously it would be controversial, I think.
It's true.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's one of those. It gives you the opportunity to explore if you're a character who can be any physical representation of a person. Does it matter what your does that even become a problem, for lack of a better term, if if Logan identifies as heterosexual and Morph can just be a woman for him, can they just do that?
Yeah,
I think, yeah.
So
No, go ahead, Steve.
I mean, so we're really learning about Morph for the first time here. And Morph appears in just like a couple episodes in the original show, and is dead for most of it, or presumed dead for most of it. And
Right.
so they're a practical joker, and they are a sort of like sarcastic wit. And so it's hard to know exactly how to take some of that perceived flirtation from Morph towards Wolverine as kind of like just ribbing or kind of messing around versus sort of like an expression of some unresolved feelings, because the Wolverine is very attached to Morph, we presume, uh as a comrade, or as a fellow soldier, as a colleague in the original show, and you know uh, is really upset with the others for not grieving Morph enough when they're presumed dead. So I think this is again, those were the two characters who didn't have an arc of their own. I wonder if there is something there that got cut because there was so much. It's just the show was so overstuffed. If it's something we'll explore in season 2, yeah, I'm curious to see where they go with that. But I think at this point, it's they're opening up a very interesting portrayal of gender through Morph. And yeah, when your presentation is fluid, your gender identity likely will be too. Um, and so I think that there's room for this. I think they may have been a little bit afraid of backlash, or they wanted to kind of ease into it. I think Morph is only referred to with they them pronouns once in the
Mhm.
season that I
Yeah,
caught.
by Rogue.
yeah.
Yeah. And so
Good.
I again, Morph is an extremely new despite having been in the very first season, the episode of the original show, relatively new character in terms of somebody who we're exploring and giving a personality to. And there is not much Morph in the original comics outside of alternate universes. So yeah, this is we've got a lot to uncover here. And I think it's unfortunate that the plot line that goes deep into gender is the one that got cut of the millions and millions uh, that they actually pursued. But at the same time, I can kind of understand
Yeah, I
the cynical business decision to wait until season
Mhm.
2.
As someone who's non-binary and queer, like, let's start that again. People who've listened to this show before know that I'm often very quick to pick up on any possibility of non-binariness or queerness or things like that. I completely missed all of this. I didn't, and I think for me it's a couple of things. One is that so often Morph playing around with presentations felt a lot like joking around, not like trying on different identity, because he was always copying somebody else.
Right.
And I'm using he because it felt to me like the primary morph identification was gendered.
Sure.
And I think like I think what you're saying, Steve, is really true. If they had wanted to tell that story, they would have had to go so much deeper, because if I was supposed to look at Morph and go, oh yes, this is an interesting exploration of gender, I'd be like, wow, this was very clearly written by cis people and cis people only, and this is deeply offensive. Because he's only ever copying other, like, to me he comes off much more like the younger cousin in Kanto, whose name I can't remember.
Oh,
Because there's a very clear identification that this is Morph, and then it's everything else is the copy rather than him.
Sure.
And again, maybe it's them, and if that's the case, great. But like, to me, you had to either go much deeper and really wrestle with that and embrace it, or else not touch it at all. Because it is to me a very, like, I would love to see that character, of a character who really, because of their mutation, just isn't gendered in the way that we understand. And I think
yeah.
Shira, for example, did a version of that was phenomenal and so well done. Particularly because they were kind of a villain, but like all of the people who were like, oh my god, that character is the worst, would gender them correctly and be like, they betrayed us, they need to die, while like, always using the right pronouns, which I was like, peace de resistance. Yeah, so I'm sorry I'm having like kind of a strong reaction to it, because I just
Sure.
it was so off my radar screen. And maybe again that's
Mhm.
because of the copying, but also I think the way it was presented, the fact that a lot of times we met a character who seemed like it was a different character and then only later realized it was Morph, also kind of meant that I just wasn't thinking of the character in those terms.
Yeah, for sure.
So where I think the original question Riki's coming from is when at the end of in the season finale, when he turned in, or when they turned into Jean to tell Logan, stay with me. I
Yeah.
assume that scene. So
And says like, I
is
love you, right?
right. So
And
the
is that a
way
moment of
I
him only
Mm.
comforting Wolverine, or
That's
is
a
he
really good
also
point.
using it as an opportunity to, or are they using it as an
Yeah.
opportunity to express their true feelings, perhaps?
Yeah.
I think that is a very valid question. The way I took that scene in was Morph understanding Logan and what he might need is the person that he loves voicing the plea to keep fighting and let his
Yeah.
healing factor come back.
I think it's interesting that it's ambiguous between those two, and I agree that if it was going to be explored, it needed a lot more screen time than they
Right.
were giving it in
And
an
to be
already
clear,
overstuffed season.
Morph having romantic feelings for Wolverine and Morph being possibly like non-cisgendered in some way, those are two separate things. We don't
Yeah.
have to do both of them.
Yeah,
Totally.
It's interesting though here, and again here, this may be my ignorance of the original show and never having seen the character of Morph before, I think, but also kind of goes into the Rogue Magneto thing about age. Because Morph was not one of the people who I had known from a lot of the X-Men movies, I thought Morph was supposed to be more like the second generation, Jubilee's age. And so yeah, I do remember that scene. I think part of why I didn't see it as romantic in any way is because I saw it more like, a scared kid, like a 19-year-old talking to an adult in their 30s or 40s, or 140s, whatever it is that Wolverine. Like, to me, I saw it very like to a mentor figure, to a teacher, not necessarily to a romantic equal.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Can I introduce one quick tangent on that scene?
Sure.
I really wish that when Jubilee got sucked into outer space, it was Wolverine who came to in time to save her rather than Sunspot saving her.
Yeah, they leaned into that
Wolverine,
friendship
yeah,
real hard.
Wolverine gets that moment in the comics with Jean, annoyingly, but it would work, I think, even better with Jubilee as his sort of like mentee, daughter figure, just on the brink of death, and then realizing that he's needed, and snapping to in time to do that. Was a really great moment from the comics, and I wish that if you were going to give Wolverine one thing to do the whole season, I wish it was that.
To protect Tubes. Yeah.
So I have another question I want to ask, and this goes again to a topic Riki and I discussed somewhat last time. And Riki, I'll let you kind of start on this if you want. Because one of the things we're talking about is nostalgia and fan service, and sort of to what extent do you need to, is it good to do things that that fans will recognize because we've seen them before? And there were some wonderful callbacks. We talked about what did you expect? Black leather is such a great turnaround on the great line from the first of the not Chris Carpenter movies, but I like, well, the movies I'm talking about, the first of the Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart
Bryan
movies.
Singer. Yeah.
Bryan Singer, thank you. But then today we're
Ooh,
talking
that
about,
man.
well, the love triangles are, they're not great, but they're part of X-Men, so we just have to keep them. And to me, I guess this is a really interesting question: is when you're doing a new version of something, is there some degree to which it's okay to say, yeah, like we've always had the characters act in these ways, but we're going to change some things, and clearly they did. Like, for example, they they were able to say, look, we've seen the Wolverine the Logan Scott Jean Grey threesome plot line way too often, and it's kind of sexist. Let's move past that. Where do you think that line is in terms of when we say, oh, well, it's always been a part of the show, so it should just be a part of the show going forward, versus being able to say, nah, maybe it would have been better if they left it in the past?
I think the line is where it actually worked in the past or would work today and doesn't. I think they actually thought that the love triangles would work today and just failed, missed the mark. But like the love triangles and the messy strings of romance and the big feelings, big soap opera feelings, big like projection of intentions and angst. That's something that's worked really well for the X-Men for a very long time, and I can understand looking for ways to kind of throw that in, and romance is a natural place to do it.
Well, and just in general, there's a larger question, like not even
Yeah.
the
Fan
that-
service. I
Yes.
I think if fan service becomes a plot point, then I feel like that's where it kind of fails. When it's like a background comment or a cameo appearance, like having Morph turn into Hulk, even though Hulk's not part of the
Yeah,
X-Men,
or having
or
Cloak and Dagger and
Spider-Man
Spider-Man and
Daredevil
Mary
and-
Jane and
Yeah.
Flash Thompson and Daredevil
like
and all
having those kind
characters.
of cameos
Yeah.
when you're showing there's chaos and there are other heroes in this universe doing their part.
Yeah.
I think those kinds of fan service cameos are perfect. I think they're fine. Completely okay. If they did some sort of fan service that was like a 3-minute deep dive into the differences between like Cable and X-Men, if he were there for whatever reason, that's completely unnecessary, and it doesn't move anything forward for the Bastion story that they've decided they wanted to tell.
So
Like,
I'll give an example actually from the Bastion story of fan service that I think did not work, and that was trying to explain the origin of Bastion and his mother Rose and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And the origin of
It was
Bastion, by
complicated
the
in
way,
the comics.
very, very, very different in the comics, way more complicated, but in a way that drew on a lot of backstories and progressing plots that if you were astute and you were following, you would have understood. Kind of, not really. Comics has a thing like, this was Bastion's plot arc was kind of interrupted for about 8 to 10 years, and then when they brought him back, they're just like, oh, we kind of have to explain literally everything because we can't really expect that our readers were literate. Were comic readers back then, like it's kids largely. And so they did a lot there. Bastion's always been kind of a messy topic. I'm surprised they did it in this. But it's kind of a shorthand for large government and defense industry reaction to mutants as a threat.
A Bastion
mass
fan service.
mobilization.
A Bastion fan service that I don't think was necessary, and like I'm kind of in the middle on it, was him stealing Cable's second organic arm and then turning into the Bastion from Second Coming. That was
yeah, that was ridiculous.
Weird.
Is that what that was? I called him Sephiroth at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Basically, like that for a 10th episode season finale power up for Bastion, that immediately, one that felt very comics, but then also like that felt it made him more throwaway, just a larger punching bag to throw everybody at, and that kind of fell apart for me.
And so I think where fan service does work is when it is in service of character arcs. Like we did the Madeline Pryor arc and Inferno as a way to set up Scott's story arc. We did Life Death, which was completely different, and we did these very different and out of order. Like if we had had more time, like the story arc of Storm losing her powers and Scott leaving the X-Men are intimately intertwined because Storm loses her powers, goes on like sort of a personal quest, comes back to the X-Men, decides like, this is my home, this is my family, even though I still don't have powers, fights Cyclops for leadership of the X-Men, wins even though she doesn't have powers and he does. And he's like, all right, like this is the sign for me that I need to get out of here. This isn't my place anymore. I'm going to go raise a family. So like these were kind of fan service moments in the way that they're adapting kind of like stories that aren't like headline front page. What are you going to make your big X-Men movie about? But they worked in the way that they are in service of character arcs and telling sort of like the broader story of what you're trying to do with X-Men. And I thought that is an example of good fan service.
Well, and I guess I'm asking more about, I think, kind of the reverse, not as much the fan service, but more the potential fan upset by changing things. Like,
they can go to hell.
As you said, they've changed.
Get over it.
Get over it. Whatever you're watching, that's
where's Cassandra Nova?
Okay, honestly, that's
not the never mind.
Well, like if when are you saying like when
can I restart my question? Because
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm feeling a little shut out here, so I'm trying to get this.
Sorry.
I guess what I'm trying to ask about, though, is not fan service, but more the opposite, which is how far do you think they can go in terms of changing things that people think of as central to this? And obviously some people are going to get upset, and that's not. I'm not worrying about the edgelords are always going to edgelord, but in terms of like, okay, so we don't have we don't have in this version the love triangle with Logan and Scott. Clearly, it seems like most fans are pretty okay with that. You were saying before that, well, we kind of have to have the love triangles because that's what we have. But like, it sounds like also you could have done without the love triangles, and fans wouldn't have been that upset about it. I'm kind of curious kind of how you all feel about that. Like, could you have had Magneto actually not turn evil for part of the story and had fans be okay with it? Could you have had like Professor X literally never come back and have fans be okay with it? Because it does seem like a lot of times when I point out things that are like, this didn't feel the best, the response is, well, but that's always been the story. And I guess I'm just kind of curious of how far can we go and say, well, maybe we can make it a different kind of story without it no longer being the X-Men.
Like you want to tell something original, kind of. I think it's fine.
Yeah, I think whatever story you're making that has primacy, like, you know, the adapted media, like you're using these characters, you're taking them out of the toy box and you're playing with them, and then you're telling the
Right.
story that you want to make, and then you put them back when you're done. And the characters are based on such kind of like strong stock archetypes or ideas that they're going to be fine, and you can kind of use them for different things afterwards. I think to go with your example though of you know, why does Magneto act like this, and then why does you know, why is this sort of like the why do we bring Charles back? And I think that actually gets to, you know, an interesting part of uh, of X-Men, and the conversation around nonviolence, and the fact that, you know, in the finale, Charles, even after shutting down the dude's mind, um, you know, is staying with him to try and keep him alive and bring him back, because he believes this deeply in the power of love, and you know, loving one's enemies, not because of some like hippy dippy moral, or it is moral, but this sort of like hippy dip lovey dovey like kumbaya Pollyanna kind of thing, but like that the sort of Kingian idea that love is a force that creates things like the possibility for redemption, that creates things like the possibility for reconciliation, that creates things like the possibility for a positive peace rather than the absence of conflict. And that to actually create and promote peace beyond simply a tete-a-tete of power constantly escalating at one another, which is what I think Bastion represents in this comic, or in this show. You do need the presence of somebody who represents nonviolence in a strategic and focused way of saying, like, there is a method of conflict resolution that can scale extremely large, that creates a lasting and positive peace. And that's when you see like a lot of these things, the larger political arc of the show switch. Um, it is around escalation versus de-escalation, and you know, characters acting in self-defense in a way that escalates. Like Magneto is acting in self-defense when he puts an electromagnetic pulse over the entire world, because there are these sentinels that it disables that will kill him and all other mutants. Like, this is valid self-defense. However, it is destroying the world and it needs to be counteracted in some way. And so it's only through the creative application of nonviolence and pursuing a positive peace that we get to a point where we're not simply escalating endlessly. And I think you can see parallels to that in any number of, you know, current real world conflicts, and especially when nationalists feel, which Magneto is often portrayed as, feel the necessity to act in self-defense, as a justification, that their violence is justified through their self-defense, no matter the scope or the proportionate response of it.
That's a better response than I could ever come up with. So I'm just going to pass the mic.
I do want to
So-
point out
yeah.
that when Magneto does it, he's not under attack. He is not defending himself. He's defending the Earth, everyone else. But that's I get your larger point. And I think we're going to do a whole all other episode on that because I
Yeah.
think I think Martin Luther King would have thought Professor X was a punk. Because to me, there's a very big difference between nonviolence versus violence versus assimilation versus self-assertion and self-pride.
Sure.
And there's a larger conversation that I want to have about why is it that Black Panther has to have Killmonger. Professor X. Why is it always that the focus is on the more radical has to be the nationalist, has to be the more violent, instead of that the more radical maybe has some truth, and that the more assimilationist is the one who's like not going far enough. But that's
Sure.
the question I was more getting at was that, to your mind, if you did tell a story where that kind of kept the idea of the first half of this, where Magneto had to learn to love a lot more because he had to learn responsibility over the
Yes.
school. Professor X was totally off the board,
Yeah.
but we were also letting the students learn much more of his, like, no, don't try to be like them. We are different. That there's a middle ground between nationalism and separatism and assimilation, and that it can be we are different and we are proud, but that doesn't mean we're better or worse. Like, would that have been an acceptable X-Men story, or would that have, you think, gone to because Professor X isn't being proven right in the end, it would not have fit what an X-Men story is supposed to be?
No. That's one that they've done in the comics plenty of times as well. So yeah, that would be a great X-Men story. I'd love to see it. I think it's just not the story that they were telling this time, and I hope we get room for it in the future.
Makes sense. The last big thing I wanted to touch on was this question of what does it mean that tolerance is extinction? But before that, Riki, as my other kind of co-host, I know I've been really driving the bus here. Are there any other big questions you want to raise or comments you want to throw in?
Well, I do want to comment on the whole fan service thing because I've had a lot to say about it here, like on Star Wars. And to me, like, my go-to phrase is, as a fan, I want to be serviced. Like, I want to enjoy the things I enjoy and like have them show me things that I recognize and love. But it has to be in service of the characters.
Yeah.
And it has to be in service of the storyline. So talking about this series, the things that they have done differently from the comics, like Madeline Pryor, we discussed, is completely different. Inferno was like a year-long cross, like all Marvel storyline, and involved actual demons in the comics, which they paid like service, like fan service to, with the imagery that she used. Like, she had demonic things attack them with her mind powers, right? So I like that. Like, there's no way that they could do, like, Inferno would have had to have been like a whole season for it to be true to the comics. And there's no way they were going to do that. So they introduce it in a way that they can present on this show in one episode. Okay, like, I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
The Bastion, I think what I'm confused about most with Bastion is that they didn't address some of the Easter eggs, right? Like, there was a photograph in Forge's office of him standing next to Bastion and like hugging or like arms across each other's shoulders.
And
like they had worked
Trask
together. I can't remember who else was in that photo, but
there's three people and Forge's in the center.
But people picked up on that. They're like, that's Bastion. Like, Bastion is in this. Like, we don't know if he's gonna be a character, but like, that's an Easter egg. Done. And then like Bastion showed up as a character, and it was never addressed that Forge had possibly worked with him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, he never said like, oh, it's you, or like I helped him like work on this technology, like, right? And that should have been a part of Forge's character. Like, it should have been at least a dialogue with somebody.
Yeah.
So that's to me where it seems like they put him in as an Easter egg to be like, yeah, like, if you pay attention, like, there's Bastion, like, we're hinting at him, but it doesn't address the fact that it's Bastion with Forge, which I think is an important enough thing that there should have been a conversation about that. So it seems like that was like a bit of fan service that kind of got lost in the shuffle. Like they wanted to sneak him in there early on, but then like we forgot or whatever.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, they leaned more into the fact that Forge built or helped build or design the gene
Right.
cloaking or
Nullifier,
deactivating tech, with the Trask part of that picture, but not not
Bastion
how
part.
Bastion was involved in all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this actually lets me segue to another related question that Riki and I talked a little bit about last time. I want to hear all three of you say more on. To me, the potential downside of fan service is what happens to the people who don't have all that background. And
Yeah.
I actually kind of have a maybe an odd take given this show, which is that I think that I didn't enjoy this show as much as you all did, in part because I didn't have all that background. I didn't have that part of the fandom in me from my love of this show from the before, or like knowing more about the comics, that I wasn't being serviced in quite that same way. But I think that's totally okay. Like, to me, I don't think of that. To me, I think this is basically season 5 or season 6 of the original X-Men show, and as long as it's like, to me, if it had been marketed aggressively in a way of like, don't worry if you've never seen anything else, you're gonna love this, I would have been like, yeah, you kind of pulled one over on me. And I think there are some people who don't know the X-Men story who did really enjoy it, but I've certainly heard from a lot of people in my position who were just like very lost, very confused, and found it hard to care about some of these storylines. I feel like that, like, to me, for me, Ahsoka was what you guys are talking about. Ahsoka was, there were parts of that show I didn't love, but it felt very much like Rebels season 5, and I felt completely serviced as a fan in ways that I absolutely loved. And when people said, wait, but I'm upset because I feel like I can't enjoy the show as much if I haven't seen Rebels, my thought was, no, you can't, and that's okay.
Mhm.
And so I'm kind of curious your guys' take on this in terms of like, when fan service goes to the point that people who don't have all that background feel maybe a little alienated or just having trouble enjoying it as much or keeping up with it. What's your kind of like, is that, should fan service be done in a way that it doesn't alienate people or push them away, or is it okay if it does because like not everything is for everybody?
My kind of take on that is I might write a story the same way. In the sense of like, if I write a story that has fan service and then I can also like allude to larger things or allude to things that may or may not have happened in the past and they just kind of reference it, um, then my best case scenario is, say, if you have 50 fans and then 50 new watchers, if ideally a majority of those 50 new watchers are intrigued, like they get brought in by the story and they're intrigued enough that they want to ask others about, hey, what do they mean about that? And then my story that I wrote is perpetuating out and it's creating newer fans who are actively exploring my universe and not just the one story I told. But then there's also going to be, I understand that there's going to be a number of those new fans that are going to get turned off by that. But my hope as the writer is that there are more new fans than there are people who got left behind.
Yeah,
That's
there's a
totally
saying
fair.
in comics, every issue is somebody's first. And it's been abandoned over the years. But the idea was the idea was that you want to keep a lot of your core concepts very accessible, that you want to reiterate who all the characters are, what their powers are, what their situations are, and where they are in their individual plot arcs every single issue. And you end up with a lot of sort of very non-naturalistic recap dialogue, tons and tons and tons of extraneous exposition, in order to help fans who are coming in keep up. And that is, I think, was extremely effective in terms of creating successful story, like franchises,
Mhm.
and successful like resonant characters, and building a fan base where people can jump in and feel like they they might not understand everything, but they'll figure it out over time, and things will become through. They can jump in wherever, and they won't necessarily. They might have missed out on some good stories, but it won't be completely over their head. And I think the problem, the reason that that's been abandoned in comics, and I think the reason it was abandoned in X-Men 97, is that having all of that extraneous, or repetitive, redundant, um, exposition, or going out of your way to keep characters going too far from their like true north as a concept, um, gets in the way of this sort of prestige style storytelling where you have characters who grow and change over long arcs, where you have,
Yeah.
dialogue that sounds more natural, and more just like less awkward than somebody saying, like Storm announcing what her powers are every single time she uses them, or Gambit. I really think one of the biggest reasons why they killed off Gambit was because his portrayal in the original show is the least compatible with just somebody talking like a goddamn person. I'm sorry, can I swear on
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. Okay. Because he talks about himself in the third person. He's ridiculous. He
Right.
is such a bizarre cartoon character with this impenetrable accent. And I loved him when I was a kid. I literally thought I was Gambit. But he is ridiculous as a character if you're trying to tell a story with like more uh prestige oriented or up jumped themes
Yeah.
and ideas and storytelling, which they're clearly trying to do here. And so I do think that that was a casualty of that.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly where I am. Is that I love that long storytelling, and like I
Yeah.
mentioned Ahsoka, another great Star Wars property is Mandalorian,
Hmm.
which I'm gonna try and be as subtle here for non spoilers as I can, although it's a couple years old by now. But like
I
a
haven't
lot of
seen it.
fans have said that the failure to mention a very important character from the Clone Wars TV show, who should be a very important character for Bo-Katan and the recapturing of Mandalore as well as Obi-Wan Kenobi, is a real failing of the show, and they're clearly doing
Mm.
it because they don't want to isolate, newer audiences. And I agree. Yeah, and I think it's worthy to keep bringing it up because I think it's a show that, as we get more of this prestige long form, as we get more things where it's a writer, like it's one reason why it's nice to have completely new IP. But as we get all these IPs that are so locked into all these other stories, yeah,
Yeah.
because I do think, like for example, like if you had to, I'm sure someone who had never heard of Wolverine, Logan, Scott, or Jean Grey before was maybe a little confused about like what's happening with these three, is their love triangle or not. But like you can't keep retelling these things again and again. I think your point of the exposition there is really key. Let's
For
jump in.
me,
Go ahead.
the X-Men 97, like where like I watched most of the original animated series. I think I haven't seen like season 5 because I know it's bad. But where this show failed, in my opinion, if quote unquote failed in terms of like the inaccessibility, was the Professor X like Shi'ar stuff. But they kind of had to do
Right.
that because of the starting point of this episode. Like he's not here, and if they wanted to bring him back, They have to explain like where he is and what he's doing and why he comes back. And it was like I sat through that episode and I was like, yeah, I know all these characters, I know this storyline, but it seemed like a big detour to get Professor X back. And it was like, all right, like I will give up this one episode in order to get Professor X back. But like Sarah, my wife, I think she watched those episodes, but they didn't. The original episodes with the Shi'ar, but they didn't really
Hmm.
resonate. She was like, "Who are these people? Like, what is this?" And like that to me is, I think, where the show kind of hit a low point in terms of accessibility.
100%.
Yeah.
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 Matthew had mentioned that earlier too,
Mhm.
offline.
Yeah, they're trying to. I think also the creators were throwing in kind of a broader point about colonialism and power relations,
Yeah.
just in a different context to kind of um, show the transmissibility of these ideas. But yeah, uh, it it was awkward, and it kind of like it came up with an expectation that it wouldn't go anywhere because you're like, well, obviously these characters are just thrown in right now and we don't care. Um,
Yep.
Maybe as a way to mirror some of the anti-colonialist uh, hintings in the concurrent life death plot, but those were also pretty underbaked. So
All right. Well, this has been a great discussion. I do want to ask this one last question, but let's try and keep it somewhat brief. But I just, for Scott and Will, and Riki, please, your thoughts as well as we go
Steve.
right
Or Steve.
I'm not literally Cyclops, I promise.
You're not a cop.
I am a white guy, and in Will's mind, I am the whitest man who has ever existed, which would make me Cyclops.
I think
But-
you and I can compete for that fact. But here's what does it mean for is tolerant? What is the question? Is tolerance extinction mean?
Okay. I think I have a shorter answer because I think this gets into levels of conversation that Steve is much more equipped to have. So, for personal reference, I'm on the DEI committee at the school that I'm on the board of. So DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, like, ideally, companies everywhere have some sort of DEI approach to, their missions. And we hired a DEI coordinator 2 years ago, and she immediately changed the title to DEIB, so it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because her explanation is that if you are doing DEI, then you like have attachable ramps to stages for if you ever have a someone in a wheelchair, you can get them up. Versus belonging is that the ramp is already built into the stage. You have classrooms that allow for hearing impaired individuals versus you build your classroom to have the RF transmitters to project to listening devices that you already have on hand. Like it's one thing to create a culture where you accept people that are not your that are your atypical, whether it's neurodiversity, physically impaired in any way, or uh, non-binary or other religions, yada yada yada. But it's another to have it be part of your part of your structure and your build. And I think for me, tolerance's extinction is that difference. I think tolerance is just doing DEI. Tolerance is saying, yeah, you're allowed here, but you got to use that other door. But we do technically have Black patrons at this restaurant. And if that's all you're going for, then yeah, you're eventually going to die out because you're still othered in the conversation of the society as a whole. Where once you bring in belonging, it's not just you have Mutant Town where there's this segregated borough of New York where mutants live. It's the mutants are part of the teaching staff and they work in corporations and the restaurant downtown. They're part of your society, and it's just another person and not, oh, there's a mutant over there and there's a human over here. So I agree tolerance is extinction to an extreme degree. Like I think the end game of tolerance leads to extinction of or erasure of whatever is being tolerated. But that's kind of my 3/4 baked approach on that idea.
Well,
It's a lot. It's a lot
you know,
more baked than my approach, which was they combined the storylines E for Extinction and Operation
Yes.
Zero Tolerance.
Mhm.
Yes, they did. They absolutely did.
yeah, and I'll say, well, I thought you did a great job there, and like in the episode that Riki and I did before, I tried to basically explain. I think you explained much more succinctly than what I was trying to say, which is that I think that's to me that's the interesting part of what they did is it felt like they were using this phrase in two different ways. One of which being the much more like the Bastion way, but yeah, also this idea of and here's where I do think Magneto was making a very important point of if all we're asking for is to be tolerated as mutants, then we're going to go extinct.
Yeah.
In the same in the assimilationist, yeah, all that kind of
Yeah, I
stuff.
believe that is the end game message, but
Right.
Steve's right. It is definitely Operation Zero Tolerance and E for Extinction are two very important and legendary storylines from the X-Men comics that they pulled heavily from for these 10 episodes. But
Okay.
as far as the message on paper, I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And yeah, no Cassandra Nova, but we don't need Cassandra Nova. Good gods, we don't need Cassandra Nova.
Yeah, so kind of goes back to the like fan service changing stuff. Obviously, like when they had the Genoshan episode, like in the comics, Cassandra Nova is supposed to be the one who sends the Wild Sentinel, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're doing Cassandra Nova. And at about the same time, we got the hint. I think a trailer for an upcoming thing that seems to suggest Cassandra Nova is a thing.
Mm.
And then they just didn't. So I was like, oh, okay. Guess not. Which I'm okay with. Like, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Because they plotted it out in a way that it didn't have to be her. Right? Like,
Totally.
you can do these stories and change, like, a fundamental thing of, like, who the villain
Yeah.
is.
Absolutely.
If you write it as a whole. But
if you can make it work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Turns out a whole lot of X-Men villains want to do genocide.
Yeah, unfortunately. It could have been anyone.
Lazy writing.
It could have been Apocalypse. Like at one point, I was like, "Is it Apocalypse? Like, is he trying to set this up as like a
Anyway,
something? I don't know."
No, that's for
Spoilers, he's
season
going to
2.
be season 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
yeah. Okay, so to bring it back to a different question that you had earlier about can heroes retire, I hope that this universe allows characters to retire.
Yeah.
Mm.
Like at the end of the day, like when you look at Scott and all the times a new mutant or a child is introduced, Scott just wants to be a dad. Like when you boil down everything, Scott just wants to be a dad. Steve will tell you, Colossus just wants to be an artist. Like let him retire and let him paint. Emma Frost just cares about being a teacher. That's all she's ever done. And like there are core characters that their hopes and dreams are outside of being a mutant soldier, and because of their popularity it's never going to happen, but damn it, this is a chance to let that happen. You've revitalized this universe that was dead for 30 years. Like let the natural course take over. Let Scott retire, whether it's, I mean, he kind of is going to get that because of the epilogue, but like,
right,
you know, let these characters go, and they can do a crazy cool John Wick revival in a season finale or something, but like let them go and just be for a little bit.
Totally.
Yeah. I do hope they set up, I hope that season 2 starts with a long enough arc that the people who are remaining in the present, which I believe is Sunspot, Jubilee, Forge, right?
Yeah.
Those three primarily, that they give them time to be the X-Men and recruit some new characters like in the present and let the other weird stuff happen.
Yeah, I think that could be really helpful. And also just have, and granted the whole point of this is that we're in a kind of post the school era, but it'd been nice if they had just like find a way to make clear who the different generations are and what ages people are, because I do think that, like, for example, in those in the Brian Scott movies, it was very clear, like Iceman, you know, that their version of Rogue, you know, all of those are a fundamentally different generation than
Totally.
Wolverine and Cop Boy and Phoenix Girl and like, all these other people. So
Yeah.
it'd be nice. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being a part of this. I was supposed to have put in a plug for membership a long time ago. We had a long conversation here, but members, you're going to get even more content. I think we've been going on for a while. So what I'm actually going to do is use a clip from the episode that I had a while ago of myself, Will, and Steve talking about Geonosia. But also I'm going to make sure you guys get a chance to hear anything that we're going to definitely have them back to talk about this version of Geonosia compared to the Geonosia in the comics, because I had some big questions about that. But so please think
I'm
about
gonna say I'm not gonna talk about Geonosia. I will talk about Genosha.
okay, whatever. Geonosia, Osha, Wosha, Wosha land. Sorry,
I should start.
country
I should
of
start
Geonosia, Wosha
purposely.
land.
I should start.
Don't. I'm gonna drop you
purposely-
from the call.
How about Geonostan? Would that be better?
Okay, I'm gonna start calling it Tatooine.
There we go.
Oh
There we go.
gosh.
Geonoopolis is the way we'll call it. The point is,
Well, I would love it if you pronounced it the way that Boba Fett pronounces it, which is like
What's that?
Tatooine or something like that.
Tatooine.
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 Like it's in its
okay,
tween
but the
years.
point is, when Will and Steve aren't laughing at my pronunciation, they actually have an awesome podcast of their own that you should totally check out. Give us a plug, Steve.
Dads,
Oh.
Hype is my superpower. Steve and I talk. We have like 135 episodes. Go and check them out. We read a lot of comics and we talk. It's a glorified
Yeah.
book
In,
club.
in case
and-
you haven't noticed, Will and I have been best friends our entire lives. We read a lot of comics and we hang out and we talk about them. If that's something that sounds like something you'd enjoy, come check us out. It's called Hype is My
Yeah, and we
Superpower.
get-
It's
I
wherever
get excited
podcasts are
about
potted.
things.
Yeah.
It's a great
It's everywhere.
podcast. Check it out. Even if you're like me and you don't know many of the comics, they actually like give you enough of a picture to really help you understand the comic. You guys do that great job of like melding fan service with not alienating people. So
Oh, thank you.
I always
Thanks.
love that. Will, also, you tend to do things on stream as well.
I do. I'm on Twitch, Silver Dreamer, Silver with a Y. I build building brick sets. Like if anyone's watching the stream, everything you see behind me, like a Mega Godzilla and Taj Mahal and Bumblebee and stuff, and model kits and stuff. And then also on Sunday evenings, I read Marvel comics. It's against copyright, so don't tell anyone. But
don't
But
tell anyone.
but I do. We read comics on stream. People like hearing my voice, and so that just kind of evolved into me telling people stories.
And allegedly, I also write independent comics, although I need to actually publish something new at a certain point.
Look for the
Nobody keeps
pros.
saying
It's
that.
his first comic,
Yeah.
and it's fantastic.
Oh, thank
Definitely.
you.
My dad's
We'll
in
link
it.
that if we can. All right. Thank you all so much for being a part of this. Riki, as always, thank you so much for being a co-host and fighting through as we got overwhelmed. I thought I was only going to get one of these two today, but we got both. To our
Sorry.
listeners, thank you all so much. We have spoken.
To me, my X-Men.
To me, my ex-folk.
Yeah. To me, my niece.